This episode of Dispatches from Planet Albany is brought to you with support by New York State United Teachers, which represents more than 600,000 educators and school-related professionals in New York. Dispatches is also supported by the public affairs firm O'Donnell & Associates. For more information, check out o'donnellsolutions.com.
I've also declared war on potholes, so here's the first shot across the bow.
Well, as you know, with Planet Albany, there's always something that makes the planet turn.
And it's this amazing view of D.C., and Eddie Vedder comes out. And he goes, "You have a cigarette?" And I've never smoked in my life, but if I had, I wish that was the moment.
And this strategy takes us from potholes to knotholes.
I would like to say it was a pleasure, Mr. Kim. But I'm on the road.
I'm David Lombardo, and this is Dispatches from Planet Albany, a WCNY podcast about power and politics in New York. And on today's show, we're joined by the latest would-be Democratic nominee for state comptroller, Raj Goyal, a former Kansas state lawmaker who moved to New York after losing a bid for Congress in the wheat state. And you can hear the first part of our conversation where we touched on some of his gripes with the Democratic Party, how he plans on getting Democratic primary voters excited for a state comptroller's race, and his approach, if he was comptroller, to managing the state's pension fund in the Capitol Press Room archives, which you can find at capitolpressroom.org or wherever you download podcasts. We'll pick up this part of the conversation talking about how he might use the audit powers of the comptroller's office different than incumbent Tom DiNapoli.
Well, I think he's completely wasting that audit power. The audit power is so incredibly powerful. One analogy I'll tell you is that, that the New York Attorney General's office was generally thought of as a little bit of a paper-pushing office until Eliot Spitzer got in there and energized it. And now we think of the New York State Attorney General as the national leader of attorneys general. The New York State Comptroller, obviously, logically, because of New York, and not just because of our media presence, but because the financial markets are here in New York, would be the logical organizer of the blue state pension funds. And, of course, the red state pension funds are already organized. I don't know if you know about SFOF.
I do, from your previous interviews.
Oh, well, wonderful. Thank you for doing the diligence. You and my family actually listen to those. And so SFOF is really an important point, Dave. It bears underscoring and really lifting up. So the other side has organized the pension funds, has them in an organization. Every single red state chief financial officer is in that organization. And what do progressives, Democrats have? Nothing on our side. And in the meantime, they're organized, they're waging war on our New York CEOs, and we're not saying anything in response. Tom DiNapoli is certainly not saying anything in response. So when you get back to the audit power is an incredible tool to get in there and understand what's happening on utility rates, on how ICE is actually operating here in New York, what Donald Trump is doing. He's the funding. There's a big story in the New York Times. No one even knows where he's moving the money around in the federal accounts. And right now, Tom DiNapoli takes super long to do an audit. It goes on, the back pages of the Times Union, and that's it. And it just sits there. One of the things that motivated me to run was that I saw an audit around abuse and corruption in the homeless shelter system. And what I realized is that an active comptroller, someone with my unique skill set of being a successful CEO and also being in government and understanding how that mix combines for political power, we should use those audits, Dave, to solve problems. We should release those in a certain way that are consumed for the political, for elected officials, for community groups, for organizers, so that it actually changes things. He views his job as just checking boxes and issuing some audit.
I mean, I know that's not true, though, because having worked in different media outlets, I know for a fact that the comptroller's office, when they think they have something that the media will be interested in, will reach out to media outlets to promote their audits. They will say, hey, Times Union, hey, Buffalo News, hey, New York Focus, or whoever it may be, we think this is relevant to your audience or what you've covered in the past. Here's a day's lead on something like this. So I don't think they're just necessarily dumping things in a drawer. It seems like they're just dumping things that maybe most people aren't going to be that interested in.
To be clear, I'm sure their press office is sending press releases on that.
No, they're making phone calls. They're talking to people.
Okay, sure, they're making phone calls, so that's great. That's really not, I don't have an opinion on their press strategy, Dave.
You
I'm
just
talking
did, though.
about
You just said that they haven't been doing enough outreach on their audits and that they haven't been, mobilizing people.
Oh, there you go. It was about mobilizing people and about actually the substantive outcome of what the audit is. We're not doing the audit, Dave. The win, I actually love this example and the way you set that up. The win in Albany right now is to say you have some audit, you push some paper, you call some reporters, and you get a story. Boom, boom, boom. I'm going home for the day, and I'm going to have a drink. That's not a win to me. That gets back to where we started. The Democratic Party is at a 40-year low because that's the way they thought for all these decades, and that's the way Albany thinks. To an actual person, we think, why don't you solve the problem? Why don't you actually, on affordable housing, why don't you actually, instead of investing in real estate in Orlando and Chicago, why don't you lean into the affordable housing crisis here in New York City and throughout the state? It's a great ROI. It's a great asset class. Why don't you get in the game? How about a groundbreaking audit on how much money we lose on GDP in New York State because we don't have universal child care? I ran a company. I remember what it was like when my kids were born in New York. I know what employees struggle with that child care cost. The state comptroller could be a leader in helping advocates and elected officials and legislators understand the cost of doing nothing, and moreover could use tax-exempt bonds, ETIs, could help deliver universal child care here in New York. So that's the exact example of the way you laid out status quo. I would agree with you. That's what he's doing. I just don't think it's working for New Yorkers.
Well, on child care, it was less than a year ago that an audit came out on oversight of some stabilization grants. But I want to pivot to this idea of, your lane that you're running into. Sure, go for it.
Sorry, if I could just quickly on that, right? So that's great, aware of that audit. But that is a very different thing than a public-facing audit from somebody who knows how to use political power and the bully pulpit and understands how the markets work to say, I was a business owner, and I am telling you that as a CEO, we need universal child care to keep good people here in New York, and this is the cost to my business. That audit's not been done by Tom DiNapoli, I guarantee you.
So it seems like you're running in the same anti-status quo, shake things up lane as Drew Warshaw. So how will you differentiate yourself between him and any other anti-status quo candidates that might emerge between now and primary day?
Yeah, I'm obviously not focused on Drew. We've known each other a long time. And, I think what we don't need, it's never about the policy papers or the white papers or being a technocrat around how if the Democrats had... Is that a shot
at Drew? Are you saying Drew's a technocrat?
If the Democrats had a problem with just new ideas, we wouldn't be in this soup. It is about the unique mix of being able to articulate, marshal political power, having been a leader and having been a fighter. When other people, were out there just sort of like checking boxes, I went back to where I grew up and I won one of the toughest elections in America for the Democratic Party. I know tough fights and I know how political power works. And then I came, when I moved to New York, I went out and said, I'm going to start a business in one of the toughest sectors around, which is reducing legal costs. And we went on how to have a success there. So when I present my case to the voters, I'm going to be able to say with a lot of credibility, unique credibility, that I understand the markets, I understand political power, and I understand what's happening here, particularly as a guy who grew up as a brown kid in the 80s in the Midwest. We first immigrated to Rochester in 1970. And then my parents, my dad had the happiest chapter of his life and of his last 10 years here in New York City. And, New York is all about fighters. It's not just about some policy idea on paper. You have to have a track record of doing this stuff.
Well, since you mentioned your time in Kansas, I'm curious if any of your positions have changed or whether your ideology has evolved since serving in the Kansas State Legislature, specifically on maybe gun control, access to reproductive health, or immigration.
Oh, gosh. Access to reproductive health. I was the guy who went down to the well and protected the Planned Parenthood status every year in the legislature. I mean, I worked so hard. Wichita was ground zero for the abortion wars. Dr. Tiller was assassinated in my state house district. And I was when you go down the line, in fact, that experience taught me so much actually about how you articulate and defend democratic values, down the line with labor, down the line on reproductive choice, and on our economic values.
Well, on reproductive health, though, you have had comments from Kansas that were kind of out of line with the way the Democratic Party is in New York.
Oh, gosh, no.
Yeah, I mean, you talked about
Are you
things.
Kidding? I don't know where you're getting that.
There's a source from the Wichita Eagle back in 2006. There's an article where you talk about, say, increasing access to adoption and redoubling our efforts at promoting personal responsibility, which is all fair and good, but it would be out of line with Democratic talking points today in New York.
Dave, I have no idea what you're pointing to. That record is so clear. You can, Dr. Tiller's family, strong supporters of mine. I served on the board of Planned Parenthood here. My voting record on that issue in particular, in fact, if I'm not mistaken, I believe I even won an award one year on the choice issue. With all due respect, in Kansas, what we were fighting for in terms of when it comes to choice was truly the front lines. Whoever is feeding you that, I'd be happy to take that on. That's going to go very well for me because, my mother is a retired OB. We have lived the front lines of that fight, and I've even worked on that issue as a member of the Planned Parenthood board here in New York. So no issues there whatsoever.
Well, let's stick then with your time in Kansas because there's a voting record that you touted while you were running for Congress. You know what's coming here, where you talked about your record of voting with Republicans and securing their support on your bills. Now that you're running in New York, you've downplayed the significance of that record, noting that a lot of those votes were ceremonial and that you were with Democrats more than 90% of the time. So does that mean you were kind of being disingenuous in your Kansas campaign when you were touting your Republican bona fides, or should we view your now, emphasis on Democratic values as being kind of disingenuous? Because they don't seem to be in line with each other.
Oh no, I think it's a very through line, which is I was a down the line Democrat and a strong progressive in the hardest part in America, and Mike Pompeo attacked me for it. And so what he kept
unless you had voted 100% of the time with Republicans, he was going to attack you.
Of course,
right.
But I'm saying I voted 93% of the time with Democrats. And so, sure, did we name some post offices and so on? And of course, in that district is a 2-to-1 Republican district. And as I said, I lean into that. If I could win as an Indian American, be one of the first South Asian Americans elected in the history of America, and arguably the toughest state in America, I know how to take on tough fights. So that voting record is something that is down the line labor, down the line choice, down the line economic values. And so no dissonance there whatsoever. So, and, if you look at it here in New York, I helped start one of the largest organizations for Democratic state legislators. I've served on the board of Planned Parenthood, as I've said. I've spent so much time supporting Democratic and progressive organizations. And obviously, I suppose, again, you can cherry pick. When I was a young lawyer, I was an ACLU staff lawyer. You can imagine what the Republicans in Kansas did with that. when I was backed by George Soros and I had worked at the ACLU. So I understand how politics work. Attacks come and go, but my core and my consistency has been a throughput and a through line for my 50 years, and I'm very proud of that.
Do you anticipate supporting Governor Kathy Hochul's reelection bid in 2026?
I do plan on supporting Governor Hochul, and we'll obviously see how the campaign unfolds.
And finally, who do you see as a Raj Goyal primary voter, and how do you plan on reaching them between now and primary day?
Yeah, a Raj Goyal, it's a great question. Somebody who is frustrated with the status quo, somebody who sees that this is a unique opportunity to get somebody with a unique background who can make change and make people's lives better in their day-to-day lives. And so, and I'm very confident that, especially as you saw in the mayoral election, I think that we have new people coming into the process. And I think there's people from overlooked communities, big stories about the South Asian community really coming into its own, and obviously various other communities throughout the electorate. So I'm very excited about awakening a real trend of reform that I think is rebounding not only from the New York City mayoral, but around the country. People are tired of the status quo in the Democratic Party. So people who are tired of that status quo, they're going to vote for Raj Goyal for comptroller.
But what do you see as the way then to connect with those people? Because someone like Assembly member Zoran Mamdani has an amazing social media presence that he was able to capitalize. Looking at your Instagram, for example, you got 5,000 followers, so definitely some room for growth there. So how are you going to reach people? How are you going to channel that same magnetism that he was able to harness and his messaging as well?
Look, I will say this: I think my Instagram follower count was maybe at 5. At the top of the year. So we're growing,
exponential growth.
And it is exponential growth, And the other thing is, I don't know if you have Zoran's Instagram follower count from when he started the campaign. So I realize he's at 4 million or so now, and he's probably well on his way to be at 10 million at some point. But he is obviously a singular phenomenon, and that campaign grew very organically. And so I think our launch video, I'm sure you saw that, given your diligence for this interview, I think was unique. I think it was powerful. I think it certainly got a lot of views. And remember that these things take some time. And we're in the middle, obviously, where the political class is focused on the mayoral election. The state of there will be more attention to this as the cycle goes on. But I do think that people are looking for exciting, new, captivating ideas and reformers, and that's me.
For more than 100 years, the New York State Association of Counties has served as the united voice of New York's county leaders, fostering excellence in county government and advocating for sustainable funding and sensible legislation that protects local taxpayers and the essential services they rely on. Learn more at nysac.org. And we're back with Working Rules, and for this episode we're responding to the Court of Appeals, which, in a unanimous decision this week, tossed a challenge to the recently adopted law in New York, championed by Democrats, that moves some odd-year municipal elections to even years while doing nothing about the laundry list of other elections still set in stone by the state constitution. For a reaction to the ruling and what comes next, we're joined by Politico New York Capitol reporter Bill Mahoney. So I guess for starters, I'm curious whether this ruling, which reaffirmed what a mid-level appeals court had laid down, which reversed what a state Supreme Court judge found, was a surprise to you at all. It seemed, at least from my perspective, that we were heading in this direction from the get-go.
Yeah, I think from the get-go, Democrats were very confident that at least before the Democratic-dominated Court of Appeals, they would stand a good chance. But it became pretty clear this is the way we were going last month. The Court of Appeals, which is New York State's version of a Supreme Court, basically, but the Supreme Courts are something very different. But there's one Republican on there, Judge Michael Garcia. And basically, when the Republicans laid out their arguments for why this law should be struck down, he responded with things like, it's just not believable of what they were saying. And so when the Republicans couldn't convince the one Republican on the court that their argument was logical, that was not a great sign that they were going to win a majority when this decision ultimately came out. And we got it on Thursday, and it was unanimous, written by this Republican judge who basically said that they had no grounds for their arguments. Essentially, Republicans have argued that forcing a move to even years for a lot of these counties in particular runs afoul of parts of the state constitution that give counties significant control over their forms of government. But they said, no, what's in the Constitution doesn't actually deal with the timing of elections at all. It's more just like the structure of how you have your county legislature versus county executive set up, things like that, and upheld it and let the law carry on as planned. So this is poised to take effect very soon. Anybody who's set for an election this year for an office like, say, Nassau County Executive or Rensselaer County Executive, they have, I believe, since those offices have existed, always run for 4-year terms. But they will be on the ballot as planned this November in 2025, but running for only a 3-year term, and then be on the ballot again in 2028, and then serve 4-year terms from here on out. So that this ruling basically changes the terms of the office that people are running for in just a few weeks.
And one of my favorite parts of the ruling has to do with their description of the law in question, which they describe as a neutral law. And for their purposes, it's a neutral law because it changes the timing of elections in a manner that is, quote, common to all voters and imposes no form of restriction, burden, or limitation on voting. But the idea that this is a neutral law is pretty amusing to me because we think of it as such a partisan law. But I'm curious where you see things going from here, because this seems to be the last legal avenue for opponents of this law. But is there anything else that could be explored? Is this something for the federal courts somehow? Is there some sort of voting rights or equal protection issue that the Trump-controlled Department of Justice could look at, for example?
Well, we know that some Republicans, especially in Nassau, as of a couple of months ago, had been planning, if this court case didn't go their way, to file a federal lawsuit. And as of the time we're speaking on Thursday afternoon, I don't believe that has been filed yet, but I think that should be coming in the very near future. Essentially, the federal lawsuit, from what we had heard when they had filed an amicus brief in this Court of Appeals case back in August, they're going to be arguing that this is a whole free speech violation, that having a county level election or a town board election on the same day as a presidential election means that the town board candidates are losing their freedom, their First Amendment rights to campaign as they want, because they'll be completely drowned out by these other races that are on the ballot. It'll be interesting to see how that applies, because we do already have a lot of local elections on the ballot in even numbered years. A lot of counties have district attorney races, for example, and most people showing up to the polls are in 2028 or 2024 probably aren't showing up and focusing just on the issues in the district attorney's race as much as they are, say, the presidential race that's drowning out the news cycle. So it's not like this is some new idea, but that being said, it's certainly a more Republican-friendly federal court system than there is than exists in New York. So the path is not impossible, but it'll be interesting to see how that plays out, because there are other states that hold local elections in even numbered years. New York has done so with many of its local elections for decades and decades. So we'll see where the courts go with that, but it's certainly clear that they're not giving up trying.
Well, sticking with our effort to predict the future, the other element of this equation is a constitutional amendment to change some of the elections that are set in stone by the state constitution. What do you think is the actual appetite to do something like that in the 2026 legislative session? Because if they want to get this to be even closely aligned to what they're doing with this existing law that we're talking about, they got to get the ball moving on this pretty quickly.
Yeah, it's something we've been talking about for a few years now and haven't seen much real two-house movement on. So it is something they would need to act on. It's definitely different dynamics for New York City versus upstate. Not that turnout in New York City elections is always great, but you could argue that in New York City, in a race like this year's mayoral contest, everybody who lives in New York City who might be voting at least knows who the candidates are and are aware of the issues in this race. Well, you do see upstate where you and I live, I'm sure there's a lot of town clerk races where the average voter doesn't even know it's on the ballot until they show up to the polls, and they might not be motivated to show up to the polls for that. So there are different dynamics, and it's also the reality that the city elections that might be moved by a constitutional amendment, Democrats might be less willing for their own personal reasons going forward too, because we've seen a lot of, say, seat swapping where an assembly member runs for city council, and if they lose the election, they don't need to give up their seat. But if those elections are held up on the same day, that is a path that would be close to them in the future. But we are, to be fair, by the time an amendment takes place, we're talking about quite a few years down the road, so it's not going to impact anybody's plans for the short term, but it is something that I'm sure, especially some of the younger members, has got to be in the back of their minds.
So, asking you to predict 2026, does this amendment make its way through both houses and then set up for second passage in 27-28? Or do you think we're going to be looking at first passage not until that 27-28 legislature?
I think 2026 is going to be a very unpredictable year in Albany, just given all the uncertainty from the federal government and the New York City mayoral elections. And there will be a lot of things traded about, but I will say it's been a few years and we have seen no momentum so far. So maybe not a great sign if you're prognosticating based on the past, but there certainly will be a lot of trading of ideas. Certainly next year's session, we know there's going to be at least one constitutional amendment, very likely on redistricting. So who knows how broadly they wind up expanding that to include other election issues.
Okay, since you brought that up, do you think that's still on the agenda for 2026? It seems like it could have been one of those things that was of a moment in 2025 when it was getting lots of attention, but might not necessarily be front and center in 2026. And, sticking with what you said, there is so much ambiguity and there's so many changing parts that it's kind of hard to predict. But I wonder how interested state lawmakers are in actually acting on that constitutional amendment once the regular session gets going.
Well, we will probably see some point next year some real changes in other states where they continue to alter their lines and the new political realities become clear. So I don't think most Democrats are going to want to forget about this completely.
Right.
There's no real harm from them doing, from a Democratic perspective, from them doing the first passage of an amendment, even if they don't want to eventually put it on the ballot. It'll take up 4 hours of their time while Republicans debate it, but they can do first passage and then never think of it again and never send it to the voters if they don't want to pursue this too seriously. So I'd imagine they do it at some point. Now the clock is not ticking by any means, so that means I don't think we would see it in January or something like that. As long as they do first passage before early August, I believe the cutoff is for next year. They have plenty of time to get this done, and I'd imagine they would wait until the very end of session to kind of suss out what the political realities at that moment are and base any amendment based off of that rather than rushing to get it through symbolically as soon as possible.
Well, we've been speaking with Bill Mahoney. He's a Capitol reporter for Politico New York and provides pro bono legal advice to dispatches from Planet Albany. Bill, thank you so much for breaking down this ruling and the ramifications. Really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.